One of the questions that people like to ask as soon as they find out that I'm interested in mystery novels is what my favourite title is. It's Ira Levin's A Kiss Before Dying. One of the reasons that this story really stands out for me is the way that Levin uses his structure to enable him to tell 3 different styles of story all within the same novel. The first third of the story is structured as an inverted mystery novel. The second third is a whodunit. And the third and final section is a suspense thriller. He's able to make these 3 styles work because of the way that he constructs his situation and his characters, and also because of some narrative tricks that he uses in his novel. That first third introduces us to an unnamed narrator. This character is our eventual killer, and we discover pretty quickly what he's upset about. He has discovered that his girlfriend, who is the daughter of one of the biggest industrial magnates in America, has got pregnant. And she has a very different attitude to what they should do than he does. He is concerned that if her father finds out that she's pregnant before marriage, that he will cut her off without a dime, and that he's going to be stuck married to this girl and basically without any prospects. His hope is that he can marry into money, and obviously if she's disinherited, then he's not going to end up in that situation at all. He essentially manipulates her and tries to get her to do the things that he wants. When it becomes clear that he has no way out, he develops another approach, and that of course is to kill her. Now, it is unpleasant spending time in this character's mind, but it's also a really interesting experience because Levin makes him so that we learn a lot about his personality, but never gives us concrete details that we can use in the second section of the book. That's the whodunit section. So that first section basically ends with the death of his girlfriend. And the second section picks up with the sister, one of the 2 sisters of that first character, coming to investigate what happened. Now, this section then shifts perspective. So suddenly, we are not inhabiting the killer's mind anymore. We know a lot about them, but we have no information we can use that will help us hunt them down. So what we're going to try and do is project those personality traits, those quirks, those bits of information that we learned in the first section to try and work out who the killer is. Levin does an amazing job in this section of the novel, and I will say that it is one of the biggest surprises I can remember in crime fiction when we do learn who that killer is. It's done very cleverly, and the reader will probably feel like he's ahead of the novelist at points. But the payoff is spectacular, and it leads into the final section of the novel. The final section introduces us to the father of those first 2 victims, and we will get a sense as to how he has changed as a result of the deaths that have occurred, but we also see how the killer is changing as well. Their strategy is going to alter, their situation is going to change, and what that final section resembles is a race against time. We see what his new plan has become, we know what his technique is likely going to be, and so the question is going to be, is he going to be able to succeed in his plan, or will I can't really say detective, but will the characters who are investigating manage to stop him from fulfilling his aims? That section is equally well done. I've read other novels that have tried to mesh together different subgenres of crime fiction, but never as effectively as this one does. And to think that it was Levin's first novel makes it all the more spectacular. So let's take a moment and talk about the killer, because the killer is crucial to this novel. It wouldn't work if we weren't interested in him and interested in whether or not he can make his scheme work. This killer is one of the most fascinating I've encountered in crime fiction. Part of the reason for that, I think, is that we are inhabiting his mind. So we get to share in his thoughts, and we feel a little bit complicit in the scheme that he's developed. There are times in inverted mysteries where the killer's cold and calculating nature makes them hard to understand. That is never the case here. We always understand exactly what he's thinking and exactly what his scheme is, so that when we shift out of his perspective in the second and third sections of the novel, it doesn't matter because we've already learned enough about his instincts and the way that this character looks at the world and feels about what he is owed, that we can understand what he is likely going to do in these situations. I think the other thing that can be difficult to understand in inverted mysteries sometimes is why, with a killer who is clearly a sociopath, anyone would trust them. Now, we understand that in the real world, sociopaths are effective. They do achieve what they're looking to do. That's part of what makes them so terrifying. One of the reasons that they're used so frequently in crime fiction, particularly from the 1950s onwards. But I think what is really driven home here is the way this character is able to use the information he gains to build confidence and to get an entry into this world, into the lives of his potential victims. He is able to use the information he gains to build trust, to build a sense of attentiveness, that he's giving these girls something they're not getting from their father, which is someone who cares about them as individuals and thinks that their value extends beyond the possibility that they could marry and that they could inherit his wealth, that they can pass on his name. That is a fundamental part of this character's plan, and I think it's really effectively communicated by Levin. This is balanced by the introduction of Mr. Kingship. Now, when we first encounter Mr. Kingship, we are seeing him through the eyes of his daughters. We understand the damage he's caused in their lives. We get a sense as to who he is. One of the most effective little anecdotes about him relates to the way he has treated their mother. Their mother had been a society woman who had been attentive all through their marriage, but during a moment of weakness has an affair of the mind. It doesn't last very long, but it lasts long enough that he is so outraged that he basically cuts her out of their lives. It shows how cold-hearted he can be towards his daughters, how prideful he is. And this helps us understand part of the reason that the killer has his initial reaction when the daughter becomes pregnant. We know that he can follow through on these threats. We know that he's done it before. We know that he has an extremely moralistic attitude that may even extend towards callousness towards his children and a lack of understanding. So I think that it is very easy to understand how he can prey on these daughters. At the same time, we see this character change, the father. And what is most interesting about the novel is that he's able to develop this change, even though we don't encounter the father in person until the final third of the novel. That change still occurs because we've seen how everybody reads him, how everybody perceives him, and when we see him in that final section, he is still got those traits that identify him as the same man. We can see that they were not making things up. He was the man they painted him as. But we also see how the loss of 2 of his 3 daughters has affected him, and the way it has changed his personality, and changed his relationship with his final remaining daughter. I'm not always a proponent of the idea that the novel is better than the film. There are plenty of cases I can think of where being able to tell a story visually actually adds to a mystery rather than pulls away from it. But I do think that in this case it is absolutely true. In fact, I would go so far as to say A Kiss Before Dying is an unfilmable book. If you do try and make a film of it, and there have been several attempts, you come across one principal problem. The novel is predicated on a moment where you reveal the killer's identity. Now, on the page, this is incredibly effective because, as I said before, you never knew their identity in the first place. If you're shooting film you have seen that character's face and you've heard that character's voice. Even if you could do a trick where you view the first third of the film through the camera as though you were looking through the eyes of the murderer, you would still have the problem that you have to hear their voice. There is no way around that. So when you come to make a film adaptation, what you're stuck with is basically gutting the middle third of the novel. That is what people have done, but it is not a particularly satisfying way of dealing with the story. In essence, you're pulling out the book's greatest moment, and there's no way around it. I don't think you can say that any of the films have made a bad choice. I just don't think you can make that film work. The 1956 film is certainly beautifully shot. There are some incredibly interesting camera choices, and I think if you're looking at the cinematography, it's gorgeous. I'd also say that the performances are fairly good. They are a little stilted. I think that Jeffrey Hunter is never going to be my favourite type of film actor. But you've got a very young Joanne Woodward. She's very good. She plays the first victim of the killer. And then you have Robert Wagner playing the killer's character as well. And he is not necessarily a particularly dynamic choice, but he is absolutely right for that character. As we encounter him in the novel, you get a sense of who he is visually. You don't need to hear his monologue to understand who he is. So the film is fine. It does a decent job of adapting the first third. Some of the changes it makes to the final third I'm not in love with, but it's a decent thriller conclusion. It has some issues with trying to adhere to the morality of the period in which the film was made. The book is way more daring, and there's some stuff that the film basically glosses over to try and avoid being hit by the censor. But as I say, the principal problem is that middle third of the novel just isn't there. If you are going to watch the film, I would certainly say you need to read the book first and enjoy that moment while you still have it. Because the minute you see the film, it's spoiled for you forever, and that twist just will not work. A Kiss Before Dying is, for me, the gold standard when it comes to mystery fiction. I think the construction is gorgeous. I think that the storytelling is superb. The thematic development is really clever. And I think what it does incredibly well is really establish the killer's cruelty. This is a character who works his way close to these vulnerable women and takes advantage of them. And when they cease to offer an opportunity for him to achieve his goals, he is vicious in the way he moves forwards. It is shocking. It is effective. It remains one of the most visceral pieces of storytelling I can remember having encountered. And I think the reason is just getting inside that killer's head. It's not a pretty place to be, but it is just so effectively done. It is an incredible first novel. I can't think of another writer who hits the ground running with a story that's quite this ambitious and so successful. There are no parts of this story that really don't work for me. The only thing I can think of is a moment that is designed to cue something later in the novel. It feels a little awkward when that happens. Basically, it's a piece of music and we hear the lyrics of it. And it's designed to give us a clue later, but when you first encounter it, it stands out in a way that feels inartful. But that's the only part of this novel that I don't think works. And I think it's made up for in the way that pays off later, so I can't even hold that against it. If you've never read A Kiss Before Dying, I heartily recommend it, particularly if you're interested in inverted crime novels. It is, without doubt, my favourite crime novel of all time, and it's one I wouldn't hesitate to recommend to anyone.